University of Melbourne. I'm the president of TASA, at least for a couple of days more, coming to the end of 4 years in that role. And I'll be handing over very soon to our incoming president, Alfia Possame-City, who, as current vice president, has been responsible for organising this wonderful event, this virtual conference we're holding this year with a lot of help from our executive officer, Sally Daly. So thank you to both of them for pulling this together. So our virtual conference, and we're starting today with a plenary on COVID-19, and I'll hand over to our chairs, Professor Karen Willis and Associate Professor Kate Hapatz in a second. This event came about to replace our face-to-face conference, which was going to take place at the ANU in Canberra. And we haven't cancelled that. We've just, like so many other things this year, put it off. So we'll be going to Canberra, fingers crossed, next year at around this time. And I look forward to seeing you face to face, but I'm enjoying getting to see you all virtually face to face today. So I lived in Canberra, where we were going to go for a little while. And there's the ANU campus is on Ngunnawal country. And Mount Ainslie, the mountain, well, it's a hill really in the centre of Canberra. As you walk up there, has a plaque talking about that place being a meeting place for the Ngunnawal and surrounding First Nations groups in Canberra, all the way up to the Yuin Nation up in Ulladulla, if you head up the New South Wales coast for quite a while. So it was a place where people came together to meet. And this year, we're all coming together to meet from all different places. And we're in those places as we meet. So I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne. And I want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. And one of the wonderful traditions, or traditions isn't the right word yet, but one of the wonderful things that has emerged this year as we've been meeting virtually is people acknowledging the lands that they're on as we meet. So please, if you can, jump into the chat and let us know the lands that you're on and where you're joining us from. And we'll acknowledge the lands of the First Nations people all over Australia, and possibly you might even be joining us from other parts of the world. So please let us know where from. So with that acknowledgement, I want to now hand over to the chairs for this plenary session, Karen Willis and Kate Hapatz. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Dan. I appreciate the introduction. It's great to be here with such a wonderful panel, and even though we couldn't have the conference face to face, it's wonderful to see so many people attend virtually. My name's Kate Hapatz. I am the Joint EIC of Journal of Sociology. I'm an Associate Professor at Western Sydney University. And Karen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Dan. And thanks very much to Alfia for organising this event. My name's Karen Willis, and along with Sarah McLean, I'm the Joint Editor-in-Chief for Health Sociology Review, and I'm a Professor of Allied Health Research at La Trobe University. Kate, did you want to go first, just talking about the JOS issue, and then I'll talk about HSR?
Sure. So we've assembled some wonderful speakers today from our two special sections on the sociology of COVID-19. And Steve and I put together this rapid response commentary in order to highlight the significance of sociology for understanding this pandemic. And so we formulated this special section, which has been online so far and will be printed in our December issue. And we have invited commentators, so it's a little bit of a different structure to the one that we saw in Health Sociology Review. Karen, would you like to explain your journal? No, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute, yes, sorry, after all these months. As the pandemic unfolded and as the level of social disruption became apparent, Sarah McLean and I were approached by Deborah Lupton, who put forward a proposal to guest edit a rapid response to the pandemic, but with selected abstracts. And we very quickly put out a call for papers. There was a very short turnaround time for people to actually put in an abstract, and with the expectation that the full paper would come in very soon afterwards. And we actually had space in issue 2 of our 2020 edition to get this published. Well, Deborah and I were probably quite shocked when we got 146 responses way back in April from people wanting to submit, and from that we had to choose a very small number of 7 to go forward to be considered for the special section. And one of the earliest questions that Deborah asked me was, in line with where the journal's going, is how would we actually do the selection, and what were we actually prioritising? And so what we ended up really looking for out of the huge range, really diverse range of articles that came in, was to look at ensuring that we had international diversity. So we wanted to find out what was happening in this very early stage of the pandemic, and diversity in terms of topic. And so we ended up with 7 articles that are very diverse, that the final collection includes contributions from Mexico, the UK, the Netherlands, India, Canada and Australia. And topics range from disability, gender, racism, to things like do-it-yourself equipment and social distancing, as well as broader reflections about theoretically what this means, and methodologically how we can actually study sociologically during a pandemic. And so I'm absolutely delighted that we've got 2 speakers from the special section here today to talk a little bit more. We've also got a video that we produced as part of Social Sciences Week, and I'll put a link up to that in the chat box as well, so that you get the full flavour of the contributions that formed the special section.
Thanks, Karen. And yeah, we'd encourage everyone to access our online articles. Many are free to access, I believe. All of the JOS ones are.
And the HSR as well.
Too,
yep.
yeah.
Yep.
So please go along and check those out. So the structure of today's event is first we're going to introduce our panellists. Then we're going to invite them to give us a spoken abstract of their pieces for the special sections. Then Karen and I have a question for each of the panellists, and we'd ask the audience members to hold their questions until the end, or type them in the chat function and we can read them at the end as well. Okay, so from my special section, we're very, very happy to have Lynn Craig from University of Melbourne. Thank you for joining us, Lynn.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
And we have Sereana Naepi from University of Auckland. Where are you? Hi.
Yeah, thank you.
And we have Raewyn Connell, Professor Emerita of the University of Sydney. Hi, Raewyn. Thanks for joining us.
And from Health Sociology Review, we have Professor Deborah Lupton from the University of New South Wales. Hi, Deborah. Just looking to see if you're on screen. I saw you a moment ago.
Deborah, I think you're on mute. Can you say
mute?
hi so the audience can see you? You're on mute, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
I was waving, but now I will say hi.
It wasn't quite the same.
Oh, okay, perfect.
And Henry Kwok from Griffith University is
Hello.
also joining us. Hi, Henry.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
And so we'll start. The running order is Deborah, then Lynn, Sereana, Henry and Raewyn. So we'll start by inviting Deborah to firstly talk about the special section in Health Sociology Review.
Thanks, Karen. So Karen's already provided a bit of background, in fact, most of the background. But I suppose what I will add to that is that, and I don't really, my introduction was very short. We only had I guess one thing to say is we only had a very limited amount of space as well in the special section. We couldn't do a whole special issue for a start. We could only have a section, which is one reason we only had 7 papers that we could include of the very, great range that we had of abstracts that were submitted for consideration for inclusion. And those papers could only be short, so shorter than the average HSR article. They were only allowed to be 4,500 words, so that we could actually fit up to 7 papers in the special issue. And so that was part of the reason to have shorter papers, but also we thought that would facilitate review as well, because people didn't have to review longer papers. It would also mean people could write more quickly, hopefully, because they were shorter than usual. But having said that, what I also really wanted to see as the editor of the special section was, I was already seeing a lot of sort of what I would sort of, I suppose, uncharitably say, half-baked commentaries coming out in journals and online sites about COVID. And it worried me a bit that they were only scraping the surface really of the sociological issues that we really needed to consider. So I wanted the articles in the special section to be meaty, to have some empirical research behind them and not just very quick and dirty commentaries. So, and I think that was also part of our selection in terms of selecting the abstracts. We wanted to select very meaty and empirically based articles rather than just very, very quick and brief commentaries. And I think we were actually quite successful in doing that. We have a really great and high quality range of contributions. Because I'm a health sociologist and have been researching, I guess, novel outbreaks of infectious diseases since my PhD, which was on HIV and AIDS, I was kind of already very well primed to be interested in this new world of COVID. And this special section of HSR was actually part of a whole suite of sort of engagements I had starting from fairly early on. I think my first blog post on the pandemic was for my blog, This Sociological Life, was in early February, when I looked at the sort of sociological implications of digitized quarantine. And then I published a blog post on Medium, which was an agenda for social research on COVID that came out in March, I think, around the same time as we were advertising the special section and calling for abstracts. I published a blog post calling for abstracts for the special section. Because I have quite a few Twitter followers, I was able to publicize the special section on Twitter, which I think was part of the reason we got such great international response. And in April, I generated a crowdsourced document called Doing Fieldwork in a Pandemic, because I myself was struggling with how to continue with a ARC discovery project, which actually did involve going to people's homes and documenting their use of digital technologies and digital data. Of course, once the lockdown conditions came in, I was left, and my co-researcher Ash Watson, we were left with this problem of how we were going to do this fieldwork. And so that's when I started the Doing Fieldwork in a Pandemic crowdsourced document, which got a lot of attention and a lot of really great submissions from international contributors, and has since been used, and I've seen it referred to. It's actually been cited already 5 times, I noticed, on Google Scholar, but also been included on a lot of websites around the world to contribute to people's considerations about how to do social and other, sociological and anthropological and other social research. So I sort of see the special issue as being part of that, I guess, those early initiatives for a sociologist to start to have an impact on how to do social research, how to use social theory in relation to COVID, and how to encourage sort of international discussions on the social aspects of COVID. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deborah. And I'm just wondering, I have got a question for you, and I'm just wondering whether you can expand a little bit on, out of this the early work that you've done, and really thinking about what does sociology mean in all of this. I'm just wondering whether you can just briefly tell us, in your view, what the COVID-19 pandemic means for either doing sociology or thinking sociologically, particularly in the short and medium term. And I'm asking this question because one of the questions that comes up all the time is, should we only be doing should we only be doing COVID, particularly in health-related sociology? Should all our topics be about COVID? So just getting your reflections about what it actually means in the short to medium term as people are thinking about their next research projects, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So I also forgot to mention that Karen and I have edited a book on the social aspects of COVID for Routledge, which is in press and due out in April. And that actually was the overflow from all those fabulous abstracts. Once we selected 7 to go forward for the Health Sociology Review special section, we had a whole lot of other really interesting abstracts from all around the world we invited a selection of those. I think there was 17 to contribute to this book. So we actually had a great outcome from that as well, which is a sort of offshoot of the special section of HSR. That said, and I think looking at the contributions to HSR and also to this book that Karen and I have edited, they cover such a diverse array. They cover topics such as what it's like to be a Muslim parent in the Netherlands and schooling from home and dealing with racism. They cover issues such as mobilities and disability and what it's like to be a person with, for example, visual disabilities when you're moving around in public space in times of COVID. And issues around what it's like to be engaging in physical exercise and worried about breathing near or with or around people. I guess getting to the question, Karen, whether or not you're a health sociologist, as we know, the COVID crisis is not just a health crisis, it's a crisis that has affected every aspect of our lives internationally and in Australia, whether it's been work, education, family relationships, social isolation, loneliness, mental health issues, unemployment. It really has affected every aspect of our lives. So I think for any sociologist, I think I've written this somewhere, I think it was in the piece I wrote for Medium, for any sociologist or other social researcher, we are all having to engage with COVID conditions now. We're all post-COVID. And when I say post-COVID, I mean there's a period before COVID, which was basically before 31st of December last year, when we'd never heard of COVID and COVID for us didn't exist. And there's a period post-COVID after 31st of December last year where it was first identified. So we're now in the continuing post-COVID world, and as social researchers and sociologists, we need to acknowledge that and absolutely be reflecting on that.
Great, thank you. So I think Kate is going to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah. Next, we're going to hear from Lynn. Lynn, do you mind giving us an overview?
No, I'll give you an overview for sure. My paper looks at the implications of coronavirus on domestic labour and care. And as Deborah said, the pandemic disrupted all aspects of our lives. And it looked for a bit at the beginning that it was going to open possibilities as well as, bring some things to be more worried about. And it did open the possibility that work, family and gender relations.
Unfortunately, it seems I can only hear it.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, we're used to work and family being spatially separated, and it certainly threw that up in the air. We're also used to the labour being differently categorised. So socially reproductive activities, housework, raising children, providing family care are generally not defined officially as work, although they're laborious, time-consuming, and extremely necessary. And they also come with gendered expectations and norms. So the view that the men should be the male family breadwinner, main family breadwinner, imbues ideas of masculinity, and family care is associated with ideals of femininity. Of course, that's changed as women have entered paid employment, and men are doing more housework and care, but not so much. They haven't changed as much as women's behaviour. And so we've had a much more major change in one domain of gender relations than in the other. We seem to assume that if we offer formal opportunity in education and employment to women, the labour of social reproduction can be regarded as a private matter for individuals and families to manage. That's never really been satisfactory for women because it's actually a social issue shaped by government policies and workplace practices, but it's particularly problematic in a crisis. It did look early on like there would be change in both domains. The government might make some changes that meant that they show that they recognise the collective value of care, for example, making childcare free to parents, so that because it was apparent that if mothers didn't have someone to look after their children, they'd have to do it themselves, and many were needed in a frontline work. So on two levels, in the household and socially, it opened the possibility that divisions of domestic labour and care could become more equal. So following on from Deborah's admonition that this be empirical, this was also the case with some of the Journal of Sociology articles, and we collected some data in the first lockdown, the national lockdown in May, and we found, unsurprisingly, we asked about the time that men and women spent in domestic work and care, and also how they felt about it. So yes, massive amounts of unpaid care labour were devolved back to the home. But for most families, time in unpaid work was significantly higher than it had been before. Men's time on average rose by more than 2.5 hours a day, and women's by more than 3.5 hours a day. And in some ways, it narrowed the gaps. Extra care from men narrowed the relative gender gap, although obviously from a much lower base. And but that didn't occur for housework and household management, and the gender gaps were not removed at all. And women were doing a great deal more on top of what they had been before. Again, it involved homeschooling, an extra taxing requirement, and it was very stressful for all families. So we were interested in how it felt with satisfaction and with gender shares, and we found that before COVID, more than half of women had already been very dissatisfied with how they shared their housework and unpaid care with their partner, and only about 12% of men had been. This doubled during COVID, so men were very dissatisfied with how they were spending their time, and also with their partner share, although, you know, in empirical terms, they were only doing about a bit less than what women had been doing before. So for women, the dissatisfaction was off the charts, really. Especially the surprise, I think. I mean, many mentioned that it was, you know, like being back to the 50s. And there's one really nice quote I like from saying, you know, how could a contemporary female like myself with feminist principles and innovative thinking capacity still end up cohabiting with a caveman? So I think that it was a testing time. Everybody put their shoulder to the wheel, but in fact it was the gender divisions were by no means removed. And of course, but the structures don't change, so we wouldn't really necessarily expect that they would. And also, I think Kate's going to ask me more of a question about this, but the question of whether the pandemic would engender more government recognition of women's family constraints is very mixed and rather disappointing so far.
Thanks so much, Lynn. It's really important research, and one study that's shown us how entrenched inequality is and how the pandemic has exacerbated inequities. So, Lynn, do you see any evidence of governments engendering a sustained recognition of women's unpaid care commitments and government support for participation in the labour market? Is there any evidence?
Well, I think governments always like women to participate in the labour market, but the recognition that to have that be done on an equitable basis requires much more of a care infrastructure than we've currently got does seem to have been fleeting. I mean, it wasn't only in childcare where, you know, as I said, it was made free for a temporary period, and then it was actually the first sector that had job seeker withdrawn from it, going back to being paid for by parents very quickly. But there was a similar sort of chink of recognition in the aged care sector as well, because as time progressed and it took over the months of the winter, the crisis in aged care showed up the systemic costs of poor care services. A lot of work in aged care is unpredictable, casual, people working across different facilities, like we know the security guards were doing, and in the care sector, it's disproportionately women, low paid, undervalued for the actual importance and skill level required. The government did, in only, I'm not even sure if this was wider than Victoria, but there were in some places subsidies to care homes were introduced to retain some workers, and allowances to families to take elders out of care, out of aged care to care at home, which also meant that they could see that there was a social need for this. But as long as we continue to have care be seen as either provided by families or through a for-profit system, it's a false economy. And to have the jobs that women take be disproportionately underpaid and casual and insecure means that they can't, it's built on the fact that the care is not regarded as a collective responsibility, a social issue, and really entrenches the gender differences that we have. So we've also seen that there's been more stimulus in male-dominated sectors like construction and in female-dominated sectors. There is a little bit of hope in that, again, in Victoria with pandemic sick leave being introduced. And I think that generally we need to have a much more systemic understanding, which is so far not really materialised.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Okay, next we have Sereana Naepi. Hi, Sereana.
Hi, thank you, Kate. So Nisa Bulavanaka, my name is Sereana Naepi. I'm named after my great-grandmother who raised my mother in the village of Nakinda in Naita City. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that I wrote with Simon Barber that sort of asked us to, I guess, when we were envisioning the paper, we saw it as an opportunity to call our discipline to account. One of the things that we know is that pandemics exacerbate and intensify existing conditions. So anything that was happening in the university or in sociology for Māori and Pacific and Aotearoa, COVID-19 was going to make this worse. That was sort of our first assumption. And our second assumption was that universities are key institutions for either challenging or re-entrenching settler norms. So what we did is we sort of took a close lens to our own discipline and said, what is sociology saying it is? What is sociology actually? And how is COVID-19 going to make this worse or making it worse? Or is this an opportunity for us as a discipline to step up and be what we proclaim to be? One of the key sort of points is that we wanted to make is that sociology knows the talk. We know what we're supposed to say, but unfortunately aspirational non-racism in sociology will remain just that, a performance that actually secures the discipline's aversion to confronting racism unless we actually do something. It's not enough for us to know the right words and know the right theories. We need to actually do something that enables sociology to look and to have grown from the very land that it stands on. So we see this in Aotearoa when we see very few Māori or Pacific sociology courses, even less that are taught by Māori and Pacific who are employed full-time in sociology lecturing positions. We have so few Māori Pacific sociologists in sociology in our own country. We see a lot of Māori and Pacific sociology trained heading out to other disciplines. So what is it about our discipline that makes them not want to stay within us? And for us, it was about, we have a responsibility to walk the talk of our discipline And we need to push the academy as a whole, not to talk about bias or diversity, but to actually say racism, and to push our institutions to address the racism in meaningful ways beyond sort of brochure pictures and inclusive languaging. We all know the terms we're supposed to use, but it's actually about doing something beyond this. And that means that we really need to take into account what we're teaching. What we teach shows what we value. And if we fail to teach Indigenous thought in our sociology classrooms, then we fail to value it. And we're also telling our students that Indigenous knowledge is not valuable. We're telling our students that Indigenous thought has nothing to offer the field of sociology, and that's simply not the case. When we think about Indigenous scholars who are trained in sociology and the impact that they're having outside of sociology, then we know that they have something to offer our own discipline. And what we were really worried about is that COVID-19 has meant that our institutions are facing financial pressures, and the first thing they did was cut HR costs. And we've all experienced that, and my thoughts are with my Australian colleagues who I know a lot of you are facing some pretty horrific cuts to the universities. Ours have yet to announce theirs in a meaningful way, but I'm sure it's coming. And one thing that we do know is that Māori and Pacific are overrepresented in temporary academic positions in New Zealand. So this meant things like Pacific's research assistants getting a phone call to say, your contract ends tomorrow, even though it was meant to end in 3 months. It means that our professional teaching fellows are being told there's no PTF position for you next year. It means that our Māori and Pacific postdocs are not seeing those postdoctoral positions turn into full-time employment. So in this move to cut costs through HR, we're seeing this sort of re-entrenchment of settler colonial ideas and racism because Māori and Pacific are having that key pipeline just cut. And we don't have a pipeline into the academy anymore because of cost-saving measures. And one of the other things we also sort of wanted to think about is that for sociology to remain a vital voice in the years to come, we have to be transformed by its encounter with other ways of thinking, learning, and knowing. So the sociology that we do in Aotearoa needs to reflect this whenua. It needs to reflect the lands it stands on, which means interacting with the people of this land and the knowledge of this land. That's when we're going to see sociology that, as my wonderful colleague Barbara put it, Simon Barber put it, at the moment we're practicing sociology that kind of looks like a sociological form of Eurovision karaoke. What we really want is to contribute something to the field of sociology that looks like sociology from Aotearoa, that feels like sociology from Aotearoa. We have things to offer the discipline, and that this is, I think, a critique that can be applied quite widely, is that we're not creating sociology that reflects the whenua, the vanua, or the land on which we plant our feet.
Thanks so much, Sereana. So you've just spoken then and you elaborate in your paper on how COVID-19 human resource cuts have really had a devastating impact on the Māori and Pacific academic workforce. What advice do you have to your sociology community colleagues in terms of how we might respond to these kind of cuts in Australia as well, for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce?
I think we've sort of got to take an immediate, medium, and long-term view to this. In the immediate, it means doing whatever you can to advocate for keeping these positions. That's quite difficult. Universities have been quite intentional about removing power slowly from our disciplines, and we're going to see it further entrenched as they make cuts. Our ability to speak to power is slowly eking away. But, you know, if there's a discipline that knows how to speak to power, it should be sociology. We know how to organize. We know we have the right tools for research to call out institutions to account and to say, actually, if you get rid of this temporary workforce, this has these long-term ramifications. There's another Pacific scholar, Michelle Johansson, who says we need co-conspirators. What we need is people who, we don't just need allies. We don't need people who know what to say. We need co-conspirators. We need you to come to the meetings, and we need you to sit in the meetings and ask those hard questions so that our voices are heard and that we get some really solid answers. And I think that those are sort of the small things. In the medium to long term, it's about preparing Indigenous academics and Indigenous doctoral students for the reality of the job market. It's harsh and it's going to get worse with COVID-19. And so we need to not only make pathways, but make sure we're really careful in our preparation for that. So it's a mix of meaningful partnerships, really good preparation, and doing what sociology should do best. We know how to organize, we know the structural flaws, let's call it out, let's come together, and let's have the university we envision.
Thank you so much. An excellent call to action. I'm sure we'll discuss this more further. Karen, I'll hand over.
Yes, thank you, Sereana. That I think our next speaker flows on really nicely from that. So Henry Kwok is from Griffith University, and his paper in Health Sociology Review was also about post-colonialism. So Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Maybe I share the screen with you. Just very quickly about the context of where I come from. I'm originally from Hong Kong. I moved to Australia 3 years ago to do my PhD. And then when I observed during the early stages of the pandemic, I found that it's very different from what the Western media exposed in the pandemic when I look at the situation in Hong Kong. Now, this microbiologist, Kwok is a very famous one during the SARS epidemic in 2003. So I personally experienced the SARS epidemic many years ago. And at that time, the medical workers were sort of very respected, and the whole community have a very united spirit. Let's say we soldier on, we fight against the virus, we put on the face masks and so on. And then at that time, people were, the time was, in 2003, I mean, the SARS epidemic was quite harsh, but people did trust the government. And then the situation today in COVID-19 is completely different. So first of all, so this microbiologist was labeled as a racist because he wrote an article criticizing the consumption of wild animals in mainland China. And then the medical workers, because they were afraid of their workload, and that's why they pushed the government to close the border with the mainland China and say, okay, otherwise we will have a strike. So today, the situation in Hong Kong is very, very different. China and Hong Kong are much more integrated economically and politically. And at the same time, we are also more hostile to each other. So that's why, I am interested in using the post-colonial perspective on both places, Hong Kong and China. Because Hong Kong used to be a British colony, and so post-colonial makes sense. But for China, I would also argue that China can be analyzed using the post-colonial perspective, because it was the healthcare system was once very much influenced by the Soviet Union and the communist past. And that's why I think the post-colonial perspective can be very interesting. Now, my article basically is divided into two main parts. Like the first part is a quick summary of the Asian scholars, particularly the anthropologists' work on the history of healthcare system in mainland China. Like when I actually came across a very interesting interview with this anthropologist, Liu Shaohua from Taiwan. And then she did write a book about, how the Chinese healthcare system handled the leprosy in the past, and how it is similar to the situation today in the COVID-19 in Wuhan. And also, it was sort of, caught in the project of modernization. On the one hand, China wanted to develop the best science, and they got a lot of publications, and they decided to discover a new virus. But on the other hand, if you look at the infrastructure, it was still somehow lagging behind in a way. And that's why the post-colonial perspective is quite helpful for us to understand a little bit more about the situation in other parts of the world. And then in the second example, I actually talk a little bit more about Hong Kong, because as I think the paper, Professor Raewyn will probably talk about that as well. I think the virus itself is sort of a kind of an actor that triggered a lot of fear. like, Hong Kong, were struck by the SARS epidemic in 2003. And then this year, so we had COVID-19. But after SARS epidemic in 2003, now there were a lot of changing policies in healthcare in Hong Kong and also tourism. Like, for example, the Hong Kong government negotiated with the mainland, and they a lot of mainland visitors come to Hong Kong, go shopping, and so on. And that kind of, created a lot of tensions in the local community. And that's why a lot of people said no mainland visitors. And then at the same time, the healthcare system moved towards a more privatized model, which sort of provided the motivation for birth tourism from the mainlanders. And in a way, COVID-19, what I can see is that it just triggered a lot of tensions and contradictions in the Hong Kong context. And the health politics is also the broader local politics in Hong Kong under the post-colonial context of one country, two systems. And not to mention, we had very, very serious political crisis last year in 2019. Now, this is pretty much the idea of using the post-colonial perspective on the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Henry. And I'm just, I've taken a sentence from, I actually think it's from your abstract. In your article, you discuss how the post-colonial perspective invites health sociologists to scratch beneath the surface of political problems such as racism and attend to the complex heterogeneity of health politics in the pandemic. And you've talked a little bit about that in your presentation, but I'm just wondering if you can comment on how we go about doing that.
Sure, thank you. I probably share one quote by Professor Raewyn Connell. I found that it's very, very useful for me to think about what happened, in the local context in Asia or in the post-colonial world. I would say that so we really need to attend to the specific social context out there, what happened. Even though apparently a lot of Hong Kong people, they sort of show a lot of xenophobic attitudes towards the mainlanders, but somehow it's really easy, for the Western media reports to say, okay, they all are racist and so on. But I think the job of the sociologist is not just to deliver the value judgment here, but I think empirically, we also need to understand more about the specific social context. And I really like what Professor Connell said about dirty theory. And that is theorizing that is mixed up with the specific situations. And I also remember in Professor Connell's book, The Southern Theory, so we need to handle theory and data side by side. They need to speak to each other specifically. So somehow using a post-colonial or sociological perspective means that we need to trace why the virus triggers so much fear, and that involves a lot of empirical work and also historical studies. I hope I answered the questions. Thank you, Karen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Henry. And you've given us a beautiful segue into our next speaker, which I'll hand over to Kate to introduce Professor Connell.
Yes, that's a great introduction for Raewyn. We'd love to hear more from you now.
Okay, thank you. Am I coming through okay on sound? Lovely. It's great to be here. I'm speaking to you from Sydney, which is a city built on the lands of Darug and Eora communities, and I'm very happy to acknowledge their position as traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking from. We're asked to give an abstract in 5 minutes, which I will try to do, and in fact make five points. 1 per minute, you can time me. Firstly, that COVID-19 and its impact on the world is a very social disaster. We know that the impacts have been most severe in many parts of the world on poor and marginalized communities. It's the impact is structured socially in ways that we are familiar with as sociologists. But perhaps more profoundly than that, the epidemic is itself a social process because it's human social interaction that actually meshes with this virus's strategy of reproduction and population growth that produces the massive growth in viral populations that are what the biomedical researchers mean by the epidemic. So human social relations, therefore, are very central, intrinsic, basic to what's going on. And then, of course, the virus happened to interact, this virus happened to interact with societies that had certain preconditions that made this a very successful reproduction strategy, including the almost worldwide decline of public services through the impact of privatization and casualization strategies, the rise of precarious living conditions, and the growth of what I can only think of as ruling class callousness and indifference to human life and suffering in many parts of the world, including ours. So in that, where's sociology? Well, from early on, people began using sociological concepts to talk about the epidemic. The very concept social distance or social distancing, so familiar in discussions of prevention here. It is a concept that comes from sociology, though its meaning obviously has been changed in a way. And yet sociology is quite conspicuously absent from governmental policy making around the epidemic. And I think despite the efforts of many sociologists, it's largely absent from public debate about the epidemic as reflected in mass media. And if you agree with that judgment, then I'm sure you too have faced the question why this discipline, which on the face of it, is speaking to central features of the epidemic, has very little leverage in public debates and policy making. Well, one explanation of that is the dominant political ideology of the day: competitive individualism, privatization, the rule of capital, the managerial state, where decisions are made basically through quick judgments of political advantage. This is a moment in which organized knowledge generally, natural sciences as well as social sciences, are at a discount in public policy making. We're so familiar with that in relation to climate change policies. But we also have to ask questions about our discipline, about sociology. What is it about the condition of the discipline that has limited its impact in this moment? Well, we're proud of sociology as being multi-perspectival, having multiple frameworks is widely recognized, and we tend to think of that as a strength of the discipline. But that can turn into simply multiple orthodoxies or multiple conventions about theory and method, including methodology, which hampers response to a drastic and unforeseen situation like this. In addition, something that's already been mentioned in our discussion, the position of places like Australia and Aotearoa in the global economy of knowledge, our dependent position in universities which are oriented to the theories and methodologies that are generated and authorized in the global north. That, I think, has hampered our capacity to respond. And finally, one might ask, what are missing in most of our sociological tools at the moment that might be needed for an adequate response to this situation? Well, people have their own views about this. I'll just mention two things that seem to me a bit missing, at least. One is the capacity to think about terror on a whole society scale. I mean, we talk about terrorist groups and so forth, but how is fear generated, and what are the consequences of terror, fear, anxiety on a whole society scale? Second thing that seems to be a bit missing is adequate concepts of the historical situation that we're in. I mean, different theoretical orthodoxies perhaps talk about different stages of development, but combining different perspectives and dimensions of the social into an understanding of what's sometimes called the conjuncture we are living in. That doesn't seem to be an exercise that's often done in sociology at the moment, but is something we really need. So what would be an adequate sociology in the context of the COVID pandemic? Well, obviously one that would deal with the major features of this situation, the interplay between virus and social process. We need a concern with the different forms of social power in the different patterns of social relations around the world. We need ways of dealing with the massive failure of human solidarity that we see in racism, in religious prejudice, in what I can only think of the stony cruelty of state elites today that we've seen in, for instance, in Australian governments dealing with refugees, but much more generally in the tolerance of poverty and violence. Well, if all of that makes sense, what can we do as members of an intellectual discipline? One thing I think is to think about what's happened in other epidemic contexts, like the HIV epidemic, which has already been mentioned, like the Ebola epidemic in West Africa and West and Central Africa. And one of the key things that has happened in those contexts is the generation of social action responses to those epidemics. In both cases, HIV and Ebola, among the most effective responses have been the development of social practices which, at the grassroots level, prevent transmission, and which responses that were active long before there was a biomedical science response in the form of vaccines. So any support sociology as a discipline can give to those kinds of developments of responses from the grassroots are important, central to what we might do. But we also need, and this also is a theme that's already come up, we need to think about our own intellectual workforce, how to sustain the workforce of sociology, both professional and the support workforce, in a context of the casualization of university teaching, the outsourcing of large chunks of non-academic university work, and the managerial restructurings, which, without naming themselves this way, are in fact a way of reducing labour costs at the expense of intellectual work and social relevance. So that's my 5 minutes. I fear I might have gone a little over, but those are the themes I've tried to develop in my piece for JOS, and which I would think a really important part of our contemporary thinking about the epidemic.
Thank you so much, Raewyn. I think you've reflected on some really important focus points for sociologists. Could you perhaps comment further on how we might become more visible to government bodies, so to policy development and in public debate? What kind of strategies could we use to make sociological ideas more visible? And
well, world revolution would be a help, but short of global democratic revolution, yeah, a few things. Firstly, we need to acknowledge that there are limits to the influence we are likely to have, given the current dominance of we lack a name for it, but neoconservative ideology in state elites and mass media. We won't get good sociological analysis into the Murdoch media. We won't have a strong short-term policy influence on the Morrison government. It's not going to happen. So one thing we need to do is work where it is possible to have an effect. My second thought would be to work where it hurts. For marginalized poor communities to develop a social response that will save lives in the epidemic, they need resources. Some of those are knowledge, information, resources to which we can contribute as sociologists. We do have access to relevant knowledge. We have historical knowledge and knowledge that's come out of the wave of new research. It's not easy. The channels of connection sometimes may need to be created newly, but that is where we can have an effect. And then finally, I would argue we need boldness. We need a willingness to think big. As I was suggesting in remarks about the need for thinking about the historical conjuncture we're in, but we also need the capacity for utopian thought, for thinking beyond the present in a meaningful way. So I would like to see sociologists discussing what an epidemic-proof society would be, how we might conceive of good social relations that would mean this kind of thing would not happen again.
thank you, Raewyn. Oh, I think we have some interference there. If everyone could keep their mics off unless they're speaking, that would be great. Thank you, Raewyn. You've provided much food for thought. I might open the floor up now. Thank you to all our speakers. I believe we might have questions either from other panelists first before we move to the audience. Panelists, do you have any questions for your colleagues?
I'd like to ask Henry a question, please. I was very interested in what you were saying, Henry, about the post-colonial difference between China and Hong Kong, and having a British influence in Hong Kong and a Soviet influence in China. And I presume must be a different sub-relationship between Hong Kong and China as well. And I wondered how if you could reflect on that a bit more. I'd just like to hear you talk about how you see those connections in a bit more detail, if you could.
Sure, definitely. I think the immediate response of a lot of Hong Kong people to the virus, to the pandemic, is, I have to say to you, because Hong Kong people were once ruled by the British, and we were a little bit arrogant. Like, you know, our mainland neighbors are all very dirty and they eat wild animals and so on. You know, we think that they are uncivilized and so on. I mean, that is at the micro social level that I think this pandemic can trigger. And we have always had that kind of racism, I think, in Hong Kong towards our neighbors, even though we are of the same race, like we are Han Chinese. But then I think the pandemic this time is very different in the sense that we are even more hostile, like, you know, they are our enemies because of what happened last year. And also we think that our system is much more capable than the mainland system, the healthcare system, because we had the hospital authority, which is similar to the NHS in the UK. And then we were once very proud of the healthcare system. But somehow after 2003, then we had a lot of policies encouraging the mainlanders to visit Hong Kong. I mean, they're not immigrants, but they are just tourists coming to Hong Kong, because at that time in 2003, we were hit really, really badly by the SARS epidemic. And then the government said, oh, we need to open up our border and we welcome more visitors from China. But that creates a lot of problems, because not the mainlanders themselves, but because of the system, the incompatibility of the system, the common law jurisdiction. Like, a lot of mainlanders know that, well, if I have my baby birth in Hong Kong, like, then, you know, they can get the identity card and that kind of thing. So I think all these non-human factors and also the complexity contribute to the deep mistrust between Hong Kong and the mainland today. And I think the pandemic just exposed all these contradictions. And I hope I can answer the question. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Are there any other questions from panelists to your colleagues?
I had one.
Sure.
So I have one for Sereana. So I was really, I really enjoyed your presentation, and you know, I know comparing what's happening in your country with what's happening in Australia in terms of how, for example, far more people are learning Maori language in New Zealand, and giving, you know, way more attention to Maori culture. But what we've begun noticing in Australia is, for example, around the bushfires we had last summer, is that there's been interest in Indigenous ways of managing land and dealing with, you know, controlling bushfires in better ways from the standard settler approach. And I'm personally quite interested in how Indigenous ways in Australia of dealing with COVID. I mean, one thing we also know is that remote and rural Aboriginal communities have actually dealt really well with the threat of COVID. I'm wondering what the situation might be in your country, whether there's some kind of attention being paid to Indigenous knowledges around managing, you know, the spread of COVID.
I think, thank you for that question. In the first wave, what we saw is a number of iwi set up sort of community blocks so that they were able to control who was coming in and out of their whenua, and also create community care. They really showed us a sort of, they showed us how to deal with this pandemic in a way that cared for everyone and also protected everyone. In the second wave, my own community, the Pacific community, was hit the hardest. We're working all of the jobs that are considered high risk. We're security, we're cleaning, we're at the border, that's what we do. And it was really interesting to see how the Pacific community responded to it. When the second outbreak came, there was a lot of pop-ups. The Pacific have the highest rate of testing in the country in terms of per capita. When we hear about it, we get tested. And so I think this communal response and the leaning on the idea of actually testing is for your community has been really powerful. And I think it's something that we can learn a lot from, rather than this is the individual response needed for you. I think for Māori and Pacific, we leaned on the idea of it's already embedded within our knowledge systems that we're communal and that our community comes first. And so in responding to COVID, it was about what's best for the community, not what's best for my income, what's best for me. I don't want to be in tax debt forever. We understood that we're going to have to make some choices and do some things that are going to inconvenience the individual, but be better for all of us. And I think that this is a really good example and a good opportunity for us to engage with the idea of ecologies of knowledge. This is one of our big questions, right? One of our big problems as a globe. And if we apply all these different lenses, we're going to see different solutions and different solutions that are going to enable us to move forward faster and sorting out the mess that is the world today. I'm all for the overhaul that Raewyn was talking about, but in the meantime, we have these short little things that we can do. And I think leaning on Indigenous philosophies of community is going to help us. Yeah, so thank you, Deborah.
Thanks so much, Sereana. Do we have any other questions from the panel, or should we open up to the audience? Okay, we'll open up to the audience now. Audience, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand if you have a question, or typing it in the chat and we can read it out for you. Have any hands? Can't see any hands. Can you, Karen?
No, I can't. And lots of stuff in the chat, but not any questions.
There we go. I think we must have covered these issues so comprehensively that we haven't inspired and we needed any further follow-up.
Well, I've actually got a question, maybe just while people are thinking about other questions. I'm really interested, and it's a question for Raewyn. Raewyn, I'm really interested in, given the state of universities and sociology within universities, I'm kind of, I want to join you in your quest to say that we should work where it hurts, but it actually is quite challenging at the moment. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what it means to work where it hurts and how we can actually do it given the political situation that we're in at the moment.
And given the practical pressures that university workforce are under, which I realise is, I mean, I'm retired now, so I'm not in the firing line, and I'm very conscious of my privilege in a way in not being directly under the same pressures. But I am conscious of the difficulty of a situation where so many people are untenured, working from contract to contract, and hunting constantly for some kind of footing, secure footing on the ground. Yeah, acknowledging all of that, one of the important things I think would be to acknowledge that we can't do much as individuals. That if there is to be a response of the kind that I've suggested, that is working where it hurts, working with communities that are more on the margin, or in contexts that are under pressure, where the concept of community itself might be very problematic, which I think is the case often. It may be more or less practical suicide to try to do this on an individual basis. It's only jointly and collectively, and with some degree of institutional support, that you can do this, at least in a sustained way. Now, I don't think that kind of support is going to come from senior management in universities in the current situation. I think senior management in universities in countries like ours has largely gone over to the dark side. They're acting as corporate managers, and that's more or less what we can expect of them. But universities are not totalitarian organisations. They're not total organisations, to use Goffman's term. There are lots of, there is still, I think, quite a lot of room for manoeuvre, at the level of departments, faculties, and so forth, to gain some kind of institutional support for things that other university workers do value, connection to the community, doing work that really has an impact. And forget about the league tables of impact, which seem to me almost completely bullshit. But the people recognise real social connection, real impact when they see it. So I don't despair. Those resources can be found even from mainstream funding agencies too. You can get work funding to do useful progressive work at the social base. I'm sorry that's all a little bit generalised, but those are the directions at any rate that I'd be looking for practices.
Thank you. And I wonder also whether it's about making sure you never lose sight of your long game, like always to know who you are and where you come from and what you're really passionate about.
Surely.
We've got a few questions now in the chat box. So the first one, I think it's the first one from Josephine Brown, is thanking Sereana, and it's a question for all of the panel, but maybe for Sereana first. I'm very interested to know if you think concepts of community rather than individualism will continue to have broader post-COVID impacts. I've just lost it. Broader post-COVID impacts there in New Zealand. I'm interested in all panelists' comments on this also, particularly with global considerations around democracy and handling of COVID in the US, which is a topic that we actually haven't touched on at all yet so far. So maybe over to Sereana and then the other panelists who wish to contribute to this question.
Thank you, Josephine, for your question. I think when I was talking about the community response, it's pockets, right? So Māori and Pacific really lived what we value, which is community first. And I think our government had a really careful media approach to making it a community, right? We were a hashtag team of 5 million, forgetting that the team of 5 million, we're all experiencing this pandemic differently. I'm immensely privileged compared to most of my family. I got to sit at home on a computer and be completely safe. Whereas, like, for instance, the other weekend I went to a family reunion gathering that we have every year, and everybody there either worked in the prisons, cleaning the hotels, or worked at the supermarket. So the team of 5 million idea was really kind of reserved for the sort of particular socioeconomic class that didn't really have to risk anything in order for us to be a team of 5 million. I don't know what we will see post. I think Māori and Pacific will continue to do what we do. We respond to each other in a community way. We think about each other. I don't want to romanticize the idea of community, but I do think that there is something to be said for the idea of thinking about the collective first. And in terms of responding to the pandemic, how do we continue to think about the collective first? You know, Aotearoa, we know we have a significant problem with abuse in care with our children. And we've just had a media article come out today about our women's prisons, and they're horrendous. We've got a report that says we need to up our benefit levels, and our government's straight out refusing to do it. So there are all these other things happening that we should be if we responded to the same way we responded to the pandemic, where we were like, actually, it's about the people, not about economic well-being, it's about well-being, we would see these changes, and we're not. We're seeing a sort of refusal to take that same, our Prime Minister's been critiqued for the kindness. Let's respond in kindness. We're not seeing that same kindness thrown to other social issues. And so I don't think I'm hopeful to see a community response post-pandemic. I think we're going to return to as per normal and pat ourselves on the back for getting us through these unprecedented circumstances.
Thanks, Sereana. We now have another question from the chat, one from Alfia Posamai Nesity. Thank you, Alfia. The question to Deborah and all panel members: should we change our approach to some of our journal publishing to be able to do what Deborah outlined in the HSR special issue? Articles were 4,500 words to allow for a quick pivot to publish a prompt response to the social issues of the post-COVID world. Maybe Deborah, you want to answer first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alfia. Well, you know, it worked well in that context. I mean, we also, what it did mean is that Karen and I, Karen helped with some of the reviewing. I reviewed all of them. We also got someone, an external person, to review all of them, and they were mostly selected from the other submissions. So we had a special kind of review process going on there as well. It wasn't just the length of the articles, and it was very intensive for me, obviously, as I was reviewing every single one and managing the whole process as well. So, I mean, I guess just to say that it wasn't just the length, it actually was other aspects of how we did it. And I don't know if that would be sustainable, actually, for a lot of, for just general reviewing, but it did work in the context of wanting to get something out quickly. So I guess that model did work in that context. And if you want to get other special sections or special issues out, that actually was a really good way to do it. But just for general journal reviewing, I mean, as we know, everyone's been inundated with a lot of additional work, and it's actually really quite hard to get people to review articles right now because of that as well. So I think that you know, that's a problem. That's a context that we have to allow for as well.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I've got to agree with that. I think it was really helpful to do these rapid additions in response to the pandemic, and certainly, you know, if there are other social issues that need a quick response, then it would be appropriate to bring out more issues like this. But yeah, difficult logistically to get articles processed that quickly ongoing. Would you agree, Karen?
Yes, absolutely. And it was also, I mean, it was a particular point in time when we actually had the space to do it quite quickly. So it was fortuitous in the timing in a way. But yes, an enormous amount of work, a great, fantastic response, but an enormous amount of work, particularly for Deborah. And yes, I'm not sure how sustainable it is. Yes, beyond an occasional, a once in a lifetime pandemic, really. Yeah, but interesting to think about what we value and what outputs we see as important as well.
I should just mention there that, I mean, it was absolutely worth it. I mean, I was looking at the article stats, metrics and everything, but I noticed, you know, we have had a very high readership of those articles on HSR in the special issue, and I think also making them open access for so long was a really important way too of getting impact there and engagement. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm just looking at the time. I'm conscious of time, but we've got a few more questions. All the questions have come in at the last minute, but we've got another question for Deborah. But I guess for everyone really, it's from Angelique. She said, I found the doing research in a pandemic document really useful, especially whilst in the early stages of my PhD. So thank you. Do you think this period is a good thing in terms of sociologists starting to do research differently and utilising more creative methods that may not go with the status quo of how research is done?
Yes, thank you, Angelique. Yes, I definitely think so. And, you know, I think it's something to consider for future research plans, because there's still so much uncertainty about how much in-person field work can go on, you know, how much travel can happen, even between states and Australia, you know, let alone overseas. So, and, you know, thinking about writing research applications right now that many of us might be doing for the next round for the ARC, I think we all need to be thinking about how to future-proof our research plans, and to have plans for doing things completely online if we have to. Because who knows what other pandemics are around the corner, but also who knows how long this particular pandemic will continue to affect us. I mean, what happened in South Australia was a big wake-up call, I think, because people thought, oh, great, we can now travel out of, you know, in between states, and then overnight, literally, in fact, for some people flying on a plane, they got off the plane to find they were in 2 weeks of quarantine. So there still is a lot of uncertainty, and I really do think that sociologists really do need to be thinking about maybe going first online, and then, if conditions allow, going how to do research in the future offline if it's allowable. But all this to say too is that I've found that doing research online, it opens up a whole wealth of opportunities to access a greater diversity of participants, including people living in rural and remote communities, which is fantastic. So there are many pros to it.
Thanks, Deborah. We have another related question in terms of publishing. Ash Watson said, what do you think the impacts of these issues and changes are on the publishing landscape in particular? Many of the standing publish or perish pressures exist, but there also seems to be a lot of opportunity for alternative models and wider different public academic audience reach. And Deb and Raewyn, you might have something to say about this in particular, because I know you've both written in a wide range of forums. Do you think that this might be an opportunity to pursue these different kind of platforms?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an excellent thing to diversify our outreach collectively into other genres. I mean, we used to do that sometimes by producing magazine format reports of research and getting those to the professional groups like school teachers, for instance, who were users of sociological research. I mean, it's a hard thing given the pressure that everyone is under right now, and the urgency of issues at the moment now. It's just a hard practical proposition to move into new genres if we don't already have some kind of channels into those. So I don't think of this as so much an opportunity as more a kind of wake-up call to something we should be trying to do for the discipline and indeed for academic work more generally, to diversify our connections, our audiences and our channels, so that in an emergency situation, some of that work would already be ready to roll, so to speak.
So I've been advocating for using open access and social media outlets, blogging, for quite a while now, and I think we need to do both, and it's worked for me to do both as a way of being able to get my research out there into the general public behind outside behind the paywalls. But on the other hand, we still have the big emphasis on publishing Q1 journals, not just academic journals, but certain kinds of journals that our institutions are imposing on us, and which I guess there's more pressure than ever, given that academic work's become so precarious. So I think I just think we need to do we do need to do both. So and then there's a way of doing both. We can repurpose materials, say for blogs, that we also publish in Q1 journals. I think publishing preprints on places like ResearchGate is a really important way of getting open access as well. So, and again, you're repurposing the materials there, you're not doing extra work.
Great, thank you. Yes, and we've got just a point by Peter Cook, yes, which does sort of speak to the points that have been raised already, that actually it's about how we conceptualise impact and social engagement during and post-pandemic. And a comment, I'm just seeing if it's a question, but I think it's a comment from Terry Lay to Raewyn, that like what you said about working where it hurts, feel that sociology still does not regard issues in the global south as a central concern that is regarded as the sphere of anthropology or human geography. would not expect a huge shift here, but merely that this stuff is treated as equally significant to the discipline. So I think that's more of a comment, but we'd be happy to take a quick response from you, Raewyn, if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, indeed. I think, I mean, there is a specific history to this, because in the 19th century, sociology was thinking about the colonized world. In fact, that was a big source of sociological data, or what passed for data then, and ideas, but lost that interest as a professional, central professional concern in a reorganization of disciplines in the 20th century university. But I think it's vital. I mean, we you know, I have no great commitment to the concept of globalization at all. In fact, I'm very critical of it. But we do live in a connected world. And what happens in China, in India, in the Pacific, in Africa and South America is fundamentally as important to Australia and Aotearoa as what happens in the global north. We're, of course, much accustomed to looking for leadership ideas, theories and frameworks to the global north. So the more we can do that, build that into our professional routines, our curricula, our search for sources of ideas, comparisons, and professional cooperation too, to the wider post-colonial world, I think the better for the discipline and its relevance.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we're just about out of time. And certainly I just want to thank all the speakers who one contributed to the journals, and two were happy to come along and talk about their ideas in this plenary. And thanks to the audience, because there's some great questions and some great points raised in the chat box. And I mean, it certainly reinforces the core work of most health sociologists, that health is inherently social and political, and the way in which we research it and think about it is vitally important. Constraints within current ways of thinking notwithstanding, and universities notwithstanding, but certainly I think we've had some really rich ideas on how we might engage with thinking about what this pandemic means, has meant, and continues to mean in the work that we do. Kate, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to echo your thanks. Thank you very much to the panelists for your rich contributions to the special sections as well as this discussion. I think you've given us and our audience a lot to walk away with. It's this idea that we're at a conjuncture, that we need to continue to work where it hurts. Thank you, Raewyn. I think that's resonated for those who are working in the public sector as well as in academia. It seems like collective momentum is something that we need to build. Think through ecologies of knowledge, as Sereana pointed out, in order to really push for structural change through doing public sociology, advocacy work, as well as that other intellectual work that we do, and think utopic visions. I think that's really a hopeful note to end on, to think through utopic visions that might be possible in a pandemic-free world. So thank you, everyone.
Just before everyone goes, I'm just wondering whether either Sally or Dan or Alfia want to say anything about the events that are coming up, just to remind people about what's happening from here on. Sorry, I've just put you all on the spot.
I was going to hand it over to Dan or Sally. We do have quite a lot coming up. Another plenary tomorrow on the impacts of 2020. And I actually think that a lot of the things that were discussed here very much relate to the discussions that we're going to be having tomorrow in that session as well. I am going to do the thing and ask everyone that is able to please come along to our AGM, which is on Thursday. We want to make sure that we have quorum at that meeting. It's a little bit difficult in our virtual world at the moment. But Dan and Sally, is there anything else that you would like to highlight? My calendar is full with all the sessions I want to go to. I think I think there's such great sessions throughout this conference.
Thanks so much, Alfia. Dan, did you have anything else you want to add?
No, just thank you for everyone who came along to this one and asked great questions. Keep doing it all week and get on Twitter as always. And yeah, come along to the AGM because you'll get to see me handing over the presidency to Alfia with a smile on my face, partly because I'll be handing over, but partly because I'll be handing over to Alfia for 2 reasons. So please come along.
And I'll just jump in there and say we've got a lot of great panels starting at 1 p.m. today. I won't read them all out and take up your time, but yeah, come back at 1.
Sally, Alfia, do we have a Twitter handle? Is it the usual? TASA?
Our Twitter handle is at AUSTSOC. I can just pop that in the...
I meant, sorry, the hashtag.
The hashtag TASA2020.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining in, and enjoy the rest of this virtual conference. And maybe we'll see you all in person next year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.